that, yeah, they had done, but really, wasn't Marcellianus's just awful diplomacy really to blame? As winter approached, the emperor withdrew back across the Danube and moved a bit upriver. It seemed that that would be the end of Valentinian's campaigning for the year, but for reasons unknown, it appears that he changed his mind and decided to keep going with a winter offensive. In November of 375, having been battered around more than enough and ready to put an end to the fighting, envoys from the Quadi once again showed up at the imperial court, begging forgiveness and asking what it would take for the emperor to desist. Satisfied that the barbarians were now showing the proper degree of humility, Valentinian's courtiers informed the Quadi that the terms would be the standard arrangement: provide X number of young recruits for the legions each year, and there will be peace. The Quadi agreed, but before they went back home, they once again humbly requested a personal audience with the emperor. Breaking with his established practice, this time Valentinian agreed to meet them. But as we will see next week, it was perhaps a good thing that the emperor had kept himself distanced from the barbarians for all these years. However, before we get to that fateful meeting, we must turn our attention back to the east. We left Valens off 2 episodes back, firmly in command of the Eastern Empire after defeating Procopius in May of 366, and now we're up to November of 375. So what had Valentinian's brother been up to for the last decade? Twiddling his thumbs and waiting for Adrianople? Hardly. The Eastern Empire, though stronger and richer than the Western Empire, was not exactly a bed of roses. So next week, we will cover the adventures of Valens, as he deals first with unruly Goths, and then presumptuous Sassanids. With the latter being a far more powerful and far more organized threat, the Eastern Augustus tended to focus all of his attention on the Persian issue, especially because Shapur was causing so much trouble in what has to be by far the most important, technically neutral little kingdom in the history of the world, Armenia. This week's episode is brought to you by Audible. As you know, Audible is the internet's leading provider of audio entertainment with over 80,000 titles to choose from. When you're done with this episode, go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome. That again, audiblepodcast.com/Rome. By going to that address, you qualify for a free book download when you sign up for a 14-day trial membership. There is no obligation to continue the service, and you can cancel anytime and keep the free book. Or you can keep going with one of the monthly subscription options and get great deals on all your future audiobook purchases. This week, I'm going to go with a golden nugget from American history recommended by listener Van Irvin: The Complete Unabridged Lincoln-Douglas Debates, which features David Strathern and Richard Dreyfuss playing Lincoln and Douglas respectively. Awesome rhetorical sparring from 2 masters of the English language. Just remember to go to audiblepodcast.com/Rome so that they know who sent you. Hello, and welcome to the History of Rome. Episode 151, Bursting a Blood Vessel. After he defeated Procopius in May of 366 AD, the East a serious threat from inside his half of the empire. By passing that initial test, the word appears to have gone out that he was here to stay, and that everyone ought to just get along with their business. However, though he faced no more internal threats during his years governing the Eastern Empire, that did not mean that Valens was not constantly rushing around dealing with external threats. Just as his brother dealt with some new crisis every other week in the West, so too did Valens deal with some new crisis every other week in the East. Broadly speaking, however, there were two big issues that occupied most of his attention: what to do about the Goths, and what to do about the Sassanids. Dealing with both at the same time would prove to be a tricky proposition, and eventually, deep concentration on the latter would lead to a mishandling of the former, and then, yeah, you know the rest. Valens spent the rest of 366 enjoying relative peace in his half of the empire, but in the spring of 367, it was right back into the thick of things. First up on the docket was a punitive campaign against the Goths. Now, as you may have noticed, the Goths have receded into the background a bit after being featured prominently during the crisis of the 3rd century. Successive defeats at the hands of Gallienus and Claudius and Aurelian in the 260s and 270s AD had brought an end to their high-flying partying, and so they had withdrawn back across the Danube to nurse their hangovers. Since those heady days, the Goths had been acting more as trading partners with and mercenaries for the Romans, rather than blood enemies of the Romans. But that was all about to change. Not because the Goths were feeling particularly belligerent again, but because desperate times were about to call for desperate measures. Shortly after Valens became emperor, smallish Gothic raiding parties had begun to make incursions into Roman territory, a problem Valens dealt with by transferring 2 legions into the affected area. These 2 legions are famous to us, however, not because of the battles they fought with the Goths, but because, as they were passing through Constantinople, they were the 2 legions talked into supporting Procopius's revolt. When the usurper successfully captured Constantinople, he began casting about for allies, and in an interesting twist of fate, those very same Goths the legions had been sent to subdue turned out to be keen on an alliance. They had always been on good terms with the Constantinians, and with Procopius waving Constantine's standard around, supporting his cause seemed to the Goths like the right thing to do. If he won, then they would be well positioned for years to come. Except, Procopius didn't win, and after Valens re-secured Constantinople, the emperor was eager to show the Goths just how poor their position now was. With both the initial raids and the support of Procopius to revenge, Valens crossed the Danube in the spring of 367, with retribution on the brain. But retribution was not the only thing on Valens' mind. He launched himself across the Danube not just because he wanted to teach the Goths a lesson, but also because he wanted to make sure that the Goths would not continue to stir up trouble when the emperor inevitably headed back to the far east to deal with the Sassanids. Recall that before he had to return to Constantinople to deal with Procopius, that Valens had been on his way to Syria. Shapur was still riding high from his victory over Julian, and, as you'll remember, the Persian king had taken Jovian's surrender to mean that he now had carte blanche to do whatever he wanted. Territories had been invaded, the pro-Roman king of Armenia had been captured and then tortured and then executed. The border with Persia was where the real action really was. The campaign against the Goths was just a preliminary sideshow. Hopefully a personally satisfying sideshow, but a sideshow nonetheless. Driving the point home that the Far East was the critical theater of Valens' territory, at the same time that the emperor was crossing the Danube, Shapur was invading Iberia. Not the Iberian Peninsula, of course, but the, for some reason, identically named region in the Caucasus Mountains, roughly lining up with modern Georgia. In addition to Shapur's general goal of simply controlling more disputed territory, his invasion of Iberia was also undertaken with the specific goal of capturing the dead king of Armenia's son. The young prince was named, and I don't mean to sound rude, but frankly I find this name hilarious, Pap, and he had fled to Armenia following his father's death and was in hiding in one of the main cities of Iberia. Completely eliminating the pro-Roman royalty of Armenia was obviously in Shapur's interests. So the Persian king laid siege to the city that sheltered young Prince Pap. Meanwhile, back in the central part of the empire, Valens was finding his campaign against the Goths to be much less satisfying than he had hoped. As soon as the legions crossed over, the majority of the Goths, or at least those Goths who had sided with Procopius, fled up into the Carpathian Mountains to avoid a confrontation. They were led up into the mountains by a charismatic leader named Athanaric, who will, just so you know, pop up repeatedly in our story as we move forward. At least partially aiding Valens in his hunt for Athanaric, though, was another Gothic leader, who will also pop up again and again as our story unfolds, a fierce rival of Athanaric's named Fritigern. Despite their mutual desire to see Athanaric in chains, though, there was just no upside to marching into the mountains to track down some scattered Goths, and so the campaign of 367 turned out to be an empty affair for Valens and the next year was even more frustrating, as heavy rains flooded the Danube and made crossing over an impossibility. Still wanting to ensure that the Middle Empire would remain safe when he eventually headed east, though, Valens hung around and helped direct a complete reconstruction of the region's fortification network. It was while he was overseeing this project that a beleaguered refugee showed up at his doorstep begging for aid. The refugee was, of course, Pap. The prince had managed to slip through Shapur's siege line and was now requesting Valens do something about the illegal Persian aggression. Valens agreed that something needed to be done, and further agreed that with his father dead, that Pap was the rightful king of Armenia. The emperor ordered a couple of legions to escort Pap back to Armenia and see him safely restored to the throne as soon as the next spring arrived. In the spring of 369, then, the focus of the emperor was clearly shifting toward a confrontation with the Persians. With the Danube's water receded, he once again crossed over the river with the overriding goal of quickly bringing Athanaric to some kind of battle, defeating him, and then working out a peace agreement. It didn't have to be the world's greatest peace agreement, but Valens did want it to come after some kind of Roman victory, for obvious political reasons. Obliging the emperor's strategy, this time Athanaric did not flee into the mountains, and Valens was able to track him down. An oversized skirmish broke out, the Romans drove off the Goths, and Valens declared victory. He then headed back across the Danube to Roman territory and summoned Athanaric to come talk terms like a good little supplicant. But the Gothic leader, defeated but not cowed, refused to cross the river, stating that he had sworn an oath never to set foot in Roman territory. Obviously, it was out of the question for Valens to cross back over the river, as it simply wouldn't do for the Emperor of the Romans to go call on some Gothic chieftain, so the two sides were at an impasse. But since Valens wanted to get a deal done as quickly as possible, he was amenable to a compromise solution, and so the two leaders met on an